Thank you so much, Domino, and to everyone for your patience. I'm now fully mic'd to the max. You wouldn't believe how many mics I've got over here. I would particularly like to thank the members of the AMS Lecture Committee who invited me and the AMS staff, particularly Grant, Haley, and Matt, who's not here, but who's very pleased to run smoothly. That actually sounds like a false compliment because we're starting late. I don't mean it to sound like that. But I'm very honored to be here and to be representing the kind of work that AMS values, particularly at this moment when the humanities feel more precarious than ever. Just last week, Doge Council ignored the $363,000 in grant money that was promised to the AMS through the National Endowment for the Humanities. And Siobhan Walker wrote a really powerful and beautifully worded email to the membership about this bad faith decision. And I just want to encourage all of you to support AMS in whatever way feels best for you right now, because it's an important institution and it's fighting the good fight. So when they invited me to give this talk, they asked me to speak about my recent book, which is actually really lucky because the work I've done since is so embryonic that this talk would have been either really brief or really superficial. And I'll try and keep it relatively brief, but hopefully not too superficial. Talking about this book does pose some challenges because it was a big project. It's like 315 pages plus like 150 pages of appendix. But at its core, the book considers the presence of racially marked and enslaved people in 17th-century Florence alongside theatrical representations of such people. I ask how the considerable presence of race and/or enslaved people in Medici, Italy shaped music, theatre, and performance, and how the theatrical representation of such people impacted their lives in very real ways. The through line that connects pretty much all of my work is a concern with how sounds represent body, and the conviction that in the theatrical sounds and music of the 17th century, we find a rich record of the noises and gestures that were deemed typical or very similar of certain types and categories of people, whether that be young, educated women, old men, lecherous nurses, rustic servants, foreigners, or enslaved retainers. The impetus behind this book can be traced back as far as my dissertation, which I completed at NYU. One chapter looked at the 1612 Commedia dell'arte play, Lo Schiavetto, in which a white female noble Italian character cross-dressed as a black male slave, and two white male noble Italian characters cross-dressed as Jews. There were also a couple of real Jews who were there. When working on that chapter and the JAMS article it became, I was able to find a considerable literature on Jews in early modern Italy. This was, after all, the period in which the ghetto, an Italian word, was first imposed, and limitations on Jewish movements, occupations, and clothing choices were explicitly written into the law. But I found almost nothing about the black or enslaved experience in Italy, and that bothered me. I wanted to go back to dig a bit deeper and to see what new work might have turned up. In 2017 to 18, I spent a year in Florence supported by an Infatti Fellowship and was able to spend a sustained period of time in the archives. What I found was an astonishing array of sources mentioning enslaved or foreign peoples, some of which I was able to connect to questions of voice and representation. The vast quantities of what I found explain my long appendix, which is a list, basically, of sources that mention black, Turkish, which is the sort of literal translation of the Italian word Turca, Turco, that is in most cases Ottoman or Muslim and enslaved people. One of the consequences that I hope this book will have is to publicize the sheer quantity of archival material that is available and to serve as a starting point for other scholars who could do more work on this front. I was and am particularly interested in sound and musical performance, but even then this book barely scratches the surface. Most of the materials I found were extremely fragmentary, often just a name or a mention using generic descriptors, making it difficult to track any specific individuals. Il Moro del Serenissimo Cardinale Giocarlo, the black belonging to the most serene Cardinal Giovan Carlo is mentioned in December of 1660, for example. Or the black of the Duke of Pisa in 1633. Il Turco del Signor Arcimboldo, the Turk of Signor Arcimboldo, in 1634. Or Lo Schiavo del, the slave of Signor Arnolfo de Bardi in June of 1634. At times, I found intriguing overlaps. For example, in 1657, the Medici princes owned a young black galley slave named Carali, whom they sponsored for baptism. That same year, the princes were involved with an opera at Il Cocomero Theatre featuring a black galley slave character named Carali. Carali was baptized with the name Mattia Medici, and during that same time, Prince Mattias de Medici was painted with a young black slave holding a helmet. This young man is quite possibly Carali Mattia, since the person who thought it clever for the Moro, which meant black man, to hold a morione, which meant a helmet, probably also found it funny to paint a double portrait of Matteo Medici with his namesake. The book is divided into two halves or acts. In the first, I consider a wide range of different performances and the traces of a large number of foreign or marked individuals, including Syrian refugees, American Indians, English Protestants enslaved by the Medici, Turkish musicians, black and Turkish trumpeters, and enslaved children. The second act is focused on a single enslaved singer, the black soprano Giovannino Bonacorsi, who sang chamber music and opera in Florence and Venice. In contrast with the many figures who crisscross the first half of the book, Bonacorsi has left a wealth of documentary sources in his wake. Payment records, a death record, libretti, and scores of roles he sang, letters mentioning him, descriptions of his performances, sketches of him in costume, a double portrait in oil, and a poem attributed to him. Bonacorsi allows us to think about enslavement and musical performance in really detailed, specific ways. But I hope that by placing him within the larger context of the first half of the book, he can be seen as emblematic rather than as exceptional. The conclusion of the book reaches forward in time. I consider an 18th century comic opera, The Padlock, which was first performed in London in 1768 and soon after revived in several North American cities. The work is infamous for the blackface character of Mungo and is often cited as one of the originary moments in the history of North American blackface minstrelsy. I show that many of the characterological features displayed by Mungo, including voice, costume, and character, rely on pre-existing theatrical tropes evident in the earlier 17th century Italian context. In the time that remains for me today, I want to talk about what race meant or how it signified in early modern terms, touch on a couple of short case studies, and then suggest some ways that I hope this book can prove useful to other people, useful to you. So first, I want to dwell on the Italian term razza that appears in the title of this talk, and explain why I think it's useful to retain its strangeness and foreignness through the Italian razza, and how the term differs from our modern concept of race. In 1674, 10-year-old Samuelo Ebreo Moro, literally Samuelo the Black Jew, fled the house of his father, Captain Chiaves in Pisa, and took refuge in the Florentine Holy House of Categorically, the institution that handled the process of religious conversion to Christianity. There, he petitioned for baptism. In 1680, the 14-year-old Luna, daughter of Abram Costa, an Albanian Jew, also requested baptism. She was described in the Categorically documents as Ebrea Mora, both Jewish and black. Children, such as Samuelo and Luna, reflect one of the consequences of widespread domestic slavery. In 1652, for example, Benvenuta, a black Muslim woman, fled from the house of her Jewish owners, seeking baptism with her young son in tow. So that's the Italian, I'll read English. Benvenuta, a black Muslim from Angola, does not know the name of her father and mother, aged around 22 years, was taken by the Turks and then purchased by Jews. She has a desire to come to the holy baptism and was helped by some Christians to escape from the house of the Jews, her owners, on the 6th of September 1652, or thereabouts, along with her son, whom she had with one of her Jewish owners. She begs and supplicates your most illustrious highness to concede her the grace of being admitted to holy baptism, along with her young son of around 2 years of age. Benvenuta was later baptized as Teresia and her son, Mordecai, as Giuseppe. While baptism did not equate to manumission for those enslaved to Christian owners, Jews and other infidels were forbidden from owning Christian slaves. Thus, for Benvenuta Teresia and others like her, conversion was a bold claim for freedom. The doubled adjectives of black and Jewish, deployed by church scribes to describe the children of such circumstance, trace a descriptive biological inheritance that in modern terms is both racial and ethnic. Samuelo, Luna, and Mordecai inherited the black skin color of their mothers and the religious ethnicity of their fathers. In my book and in this paper, I argue that this concept of racial and ethnic identity as inheritable provides an element of continuity between early modern racial formulations and the present, as well as the means to contextualize the differences between race in 17th century Florence, or even Europe more broadly, and the 21st century Western world of academic writing. Importantly, the current Italian term for race, razza, was already in use. In Il Pazzo per Forza, a comic opera written in Florence and performed there at the Pergola Theatre during Carnival in 1659, the character Anselmo uses the word razza in emblematic fashion when he reacts with surprise and sadness at the apparent madness of his only son. In La Serva Nobile, written and performed by the same troupe the following year, the word razza appears again. In modern English, this use of razza is best translated, as Kate Lowe has argued elsewhere, as lineage. In the examples above, we might say, of a sane lineage, or I take a bride only to have descendants. We might substitute family for this word that literally means race. In early modern English, race could be used in a similar way, in formulations such as, one comes from a race of kings, or a race of thieves. I note that in each of these cases, race or lineage defines a set of qualities passed down through biological inheritance that are not limited to merely physical features, sanity, for example, or an aptitude for sovereignty or theft. The term could also be used to describe groups of people from a specific geographic place, presumed to share some common traits. Indeed, the term emerges in just this way in the baptismal petition of Carrelli, whom I mentioned earlier. The Catholic scribe responsible for these documents attributes to Carrelli, later named Matteo Medici, the claim that he was born in Barbary, in Zaila, a coastal city in present-day Somalia, of the race, the razza of Granatini, presumably from Granada. Thus, Carrelli seems to claim that even in his place of birth, he was marked as from elsewhere, somewhere European, that he was different, and that he shared that difference with his biological family. Lowe has called attention to the use of the term razza in a discussion between Isabella d'Este and others on the topic of blackness and enslaved African children, dated to 1491. Isabella was keen to procure a young black girl, as young and as black as possible, she wrote in her letters, part of a larger plan to breed up a supply of decorative black court buffoons. In d'Este's usage, razza refers to an inherited set of traits, specifically dark skin, but also by implication servitude, passed down from parent to child. The category is thus more closely delimited than an entire ethnic or racial category, yet it carries a sense of inherited destiny. Blood will out. It would be easy to presume that the translation of razza as lineage disqualified the term as an early modern cognate for race and racism. But in my book, I argue that it's more useful to think about lineage itself as a model for early modern conceptions of race, and thus for a more capacious understanding of inherited difference and bodily residue. In the 17th century, lineage, or razza, circumscribed the clothes one wore, the educational and professional opportunities one had, the way one spoke, and the person one married or was married to. Sumptuary law, learned social graces, and ossified class mobility functioned to extend the stereotypical personifications of such difference as embodied material truths. In short, razza sorted people, much the way that race has been understood to do within modernity. The force of razza was quite literally dramatized in the standard travestimento of the Italian stage, where categorical differences of type were rendered visible and audible through costuming, gesture, voice, and vocabulary. In the commedia dell'arte and related literary genres, the denouement arrives through a series of recognitions and revelations. Long-lost lovers, siblings, and children are identified. Impostors are demoted. Travestied nobles disguised as servants are elevated. Relationships that were doomed because of mismatched social status are returned to an even footing, as everyone is returned to their rightful place. Identification and distribution of these rightful places was visible and audible, biological and epigenetic, learned and disciplined. I advocate an understanding of inheritance and race that foregrounds presumed aptitude among the complicated designations of difference and belonging as they were understood to cohere during early modernity. Crucially, this capacious understanding of Razza and the heritable aptitude of social status, what Sylvia Wynter would call an a-Christian premise of a by-nature difference between races, makes room for embodiment, voice, and sound within the realm of the racially significant. Nanasan Aicham's work on race and timbre and Matthew Morrison's theorization of black sound provide models that turn a sophisticated ear to the intersection of stereotype and musical style as they impact audible constructions of race. Yet such work has had only limited impact on the treatment of Western classical music. In the rare cases where scholars have made claims for specifically musical exoticisms, they rely on stereotypical and oppositional assumptions of how non-Europeanness should sound, namely repetitive, non-developmental, noisy, or out of tune. To search for the other in music history has been to reify the supposedly neutral categories of aesthetic value as inherently European. Such thinking presumes that the music of foreign others will be easily discernible as itself other, citations or imitations that stick out from an otherwise European texture. In contrast, I have argued that markers of musical, cultural, and racial otherness were thoroughly embedded into and integral to the European tradition itself. In listening for the presence of foreign others within European musical sound, we can recognize an inherent slippage between here and elsewhere, and discern through auscultation a vocal selfhood that participates in discourses that objectify people as objects in the growing global economy of slaves and other material goods. It matters when and where the voices of others are comprehensible to other characters and audiences. It matters how their sounds and their music relate to norms of cultural expressivity and subjectivity, and it matters how present historical others were within Italian culture at the time. Heard against the noisy, multi-ethnic, early modern Italian city, the voices of opera's others complicate widely accepted musical historical narratives of cultural unity and autonomous stylistic development. Today, I want to give just two examples out of many. First, a fascinating seam of archival sources documenting the presence of enslaved, ethnically marked musicians performing explicitly non-Italian music on the galleys in Livorno, both for other rowers and for the Florentine elite. And second, the training of several ethnically and racially marked children, almost certainly enslaved, as participants within court musical ensembles. Galley slavery was an integral part of the early modern Mediterranean economy, and Tuscany ran a fleet of galleys powered by enslaved and convict labor. In the late 16th century, the Medici constructed a bagno in Livorno to home the considerable numbers of galliotti. That edifice, which no longer stands, holds the dubious honor of being the largest slave compound on European soil. In April of 1624, the Medici court visited Livorno, and Grand Duke Ferdinando II at the time, as was typical, took the opportunity to inspect the galleys. In addition to tips for the marine guards, the enslaved laborers of the caravan and the biscotteria, the accounts record an intriguing payment to Carzio, well, that's a list of enslaved people that they captured. This is the quote. Carzio, master of the Turkish music, and his companions, of whom there are 27 in total. 27 is a large ensemble by any standard, and such inflated numbers are infrequent. For purposes of comparison, the court trumpets during this period averaged 6 players, and the court drummers typically 4. In February of 1627, however, on a similar visit to Livorno, the Turkish drummers and trumpeters were paid a half scudo each, for a total of 9. There were thus 18 players. On that same visit, certain instrumentalists who played wind instruments were tipped a single scudo to be shared between them, And the following month, the Turks who sang and carried the wood so that the galley would be well supplied were tipped, and the 19 Turkish musicians who played when the galley was launched netted a total of 9 scudi, 3 lire, and 10 soldi. Once again, a half scudo each. This is a particularly dense flurry of activity. The citations of la musica turchesca, I turchi della tuba e trombetti, or la musica delle gallere from 1636, 37, 40, 54, and 65 strongly imply that the presence of such ensembles was ongoing, even when not mentioned in the Grand Ducal accounts. Now, while we should assume that Grand Ducal visitations involved a greater degree of pomp and spectacle than was habitual in the absence of elite guests, these sources suggest that the Livorno Bagno had a standing ensemble involving a considerable number of participants. We can infer that music of some kind was regularly used to accompany the hard labour of galley life, loading ships, carting heavy material, rowing at the oar. This music could be sung or played and was regularly performed by Turkish musicians or in a Turkish style. The rather indeterminate meanings of this term notwithstanding, here it seems to indicate musical sounds that are recognisably non-European, either Middle Eastern or North African. These musicians likely sounded Ottoman to early modern Italians, who saw the Ottomans as their primary adversaries in the region. The instrumental makeup of the large ensemble is never listed, though at various times the sources mention drums, trumpets, wind instruments, and in one instance a tuba, though obviously this was long before the tuba was invented. It's not the tuba. Contemporary images of enslaved musicians in Livorno provide a suggestive complement to these scant descriptions. The Figure con strumenti musicali boscherecci was published by the Florentine artist Giovanni Battista Braccelli around 1630. The Figure includes, among hundreds of other images, 3 etchings of exoticized instrumentalists who almost certainly represent inhabitants of the Livorno Bagno. The musicians in these images wear the rough uniforms distributed to the Bagno's inhabitants, open at the collar and belted around the middle with cloth. Where visible, their hair is shaved into the ciuffo that was imposed upon the Grand Duke's slaves, others with a berrettino. In the central figure, the men wear leg irons. All of these instruments are depicted with a degree of detail that suggests an attempt at ethnographic accuracy. Consider, for example, the 2 differently and distinctively shaped drumsticks used by the kettle drummer in the image on the left, which records a traditional Middle Eastern and Asian performing practice still in use today. These images show Turkish slaves playing a kettle drum, a pair of cymbals, a plucked lute and a bowed spike fiddle, and the nakas, or the nakkare, small kettle drums played in pairs, as well as a reed instrument, presumably the Turkish zurna, though possibly the European shawm. These instrumentalists are not necessarily the same musicians who played on or in tandem with the hard labour of the galleys, but they testify to a sonic musical presence in the city. Indeed, the enslaved were a common sight on the streets of Livorno, and a description of the city published by the English traveller John Evelyn in 1644 is noisily evocative. Here, especially in this piazza, is such a concourse of slaves, Turks, Moors, and other nations that the number and confusion is prodigious, some buying, others selling, others drinking, others playing, some working, others sleeping, fighting, singing, weeping, all nearly naked and miserably chained. Particularly during the winter months, when the Livorno galleys and the enslaved labourers and convicts who powered their movements were confined to the city, many circulated widely within the town, their leg irons, haircuts, uniforms, and racialized features considered sufficient to prevent escape. The musica turchesca of the Livorno galleys demonstrates the many opportunities that Italian citizens would have had to hear the music of others, not only elite Florentines and other less elevated members of the court who would have visited the galleys in the train of the Grand Duke's official viewings, but merchants, visitors to Livorno, and military personnel of various ranks and social levels who were regularly stationed on the galleys or at the fort. European military drummers and trumpeters would have had ample opportunity to absorb Turkish musical sounds in close quarters and over many months of any given campaign. Furthermore, it is clear that in several instances, the Medici drew upon the sonic drama of their Turkish musicians in explicitly performative contexts. Consider the staged naval battle that famously entertained audiences in Florence during the wedding festivities for Ferdinando I and Christine of Lorraine in 1589. The courtyard of the Pitti Palace was flooded for the occasion, and awed spectators watched the show from the internal balconies. Maria Alberti has traced specific galley slaves and convicts who were brought from Livorno in order to row the boats. The soldiers and rowers of the Palazzo Pitti naval battle thus came from the most diverse coastal and inland locations of the Mediterranean. There included the territories of the Ottoman Empire, just as normally happened in each of the crews in every fleet. In this case, Alberti writes, the ethnic promiscuity conferred greater spontaneity and realism on the performance, since in the middle of the combat, quote, one heard those who were injured shout in Turkish as they fell into the water. And that's a quote from the diary of Giuseppe Pavoni. In the words of another diarist, Francesco Settimani, in order to attend the naval performance, the audience, which had been dining inside the Pitti Palace at some distance from the windows, was called back from their dinner by trumpets, drums, pipes, knackers, and other instruments of the maritime war, with the sound of many pieces of artillery, and at that noise the princes abandoned their meal. The hyperrealism of this scene is embedded in sounds, the Turquesco language, the instruments of the maritime war, gunfire, fire, and in the visible, physical, and oral presence of enslaved bodies. To presume that the musical noises of this melee were exclusively European seems wantonly deaf to contemporary circumstances. Further documents from 1608 reveal a similar use of enslaved foreigners for dramatic realness, this time with specific reference to musicalized sound. These two letters, shared with me by Francesca Fantapia, newly discovered, relate to the transportation from Livorno to Florence of 32 trumpeters, enslaved and convicts, to serve in the battalion of the stage for the dynastic wedding celebrations of Prince Cosimo in 1608. The letter says, I am sending 32 trumpeters, there not being any others in the banlieue at this point to serve on the same occasion. I'm also sending 38 slaves who are awaiting ransom, there not being any greater number that could be sent at the present time. The captain of this endeavor will be Gonsalvo Aurelino Reale, a very diligent man, to whom have been assigned 48 sailors who will serve as a guard and accompaniment, and if necessary, they too can be of service in the battle. There's also at the bottom of the letter in a different hand, receipt is noted, and Paolo Vinta specifies who is going to be responsible for the enslaved and convict trumpeters. So these letters make explicit that the trumpeters in the Livorno Bagno and on the galleys were drawn from enslaved and convict populations, and that in 1608, 32 of them were considered competent enough to perform in front of the gathered dignitaries and elite guests of a Medici wedding. The sounds of these performances embodied, quite literally, the guerra marittima. Once again, these performances demonstrate the access that Italian audiences would have had to such sounds. Literal examples of performance, these sounds are caught up with the racialized and ethnically marked bodies of the other in ways that illuminate more traditionally theatrical representations. At the same time, visibly foreign bodies were also trained up to perform in the court itself. Girolamo Fantini, detto Trombetto, the renowned trumpet virtuoso, director of the Florentine Trumpet Ensemble in 1638, the author of the first published trumpet method book, was, in 1633, given 5 scudi to purchase a trumpet for the Morino, the little black boy who is learning to play. The lessons must have gone reasonably well, for in September, the black boy who plays the trumpet received a tip in order to purchase a belt, and a few days later he was rewarded with more money. In 1634, the Moro Trombetto, the black trumpet player, was paid a zecchino, which was a little bit more than a ducat, for having played in the chamber of His Highness the Grand Duke. And in August the same year, he received another zecchino on the Grand Duke's recommendation. In a similar manner, from 1635 until at least 1640, the Grand Duke paid to train 2 turchetti into specifically musical pursuits, supporting their studies with an allowance of 5 scudi a month. The rate is comparable with other student allowances that the Grand Duke sponsored. Sonefa Turco was trained to play the trombetta, the trumpet, and Rossoan Turco was taught to dance and to fence, and also to play the Spanish guitar. Unfortunately, the Camera del Granduca accounts from 1640 to 1650 are missing, so it's not clear how long the education of Sonefa and Rossoan continued beyond the 5 years for which documentation does survive. 5 years, however, is already a considerable apprenticeship, suggesting that the 2 Turchi may have been relatively young when they arrived. Notably, within 5 months of Sonefa's inscription into the court roll, both he and his teacher were rewarded by the Grand Duke, indicating that the student's progress was rapid, at least initially. The comment here says, to solfa trombetto, 2 scudi, 2 coins, and his teacher di Rolamo, 4. We do not know whether Solfa had studied the trumpet or knew how to play before he arrived, though presumably his aptitude was ascertained in some way in advance. The sources also suggest that Solfa's visible Turkishness was prized. In May of 1636, Solfa was paid a giulio to have his head shaved. Now, in other places in the court records, I found moments where court dwarfs or Moors were paid to have their hair cut, but the verbs used in all of those instances were farsi levare I capelli or fare la barba, not rapare or shave, which instead is the verb consistently used to describe the shaved pates and distinctive ciuffetto of these enslaved denizens of the Livorno Bagno. Solfa's hair confirms the racialization of his body, maintained through dress and grooming. He thus participates, like the modo trombetto, in the audio-visual association of racialized bodies and the trumpet sound. The ceremonial and civic functions of brass and percussion sound in 5-part chordal splendor were a constant invocation of military power and the sovereign claim of force. Playing militarily, as it's called by Masson, always already invokes a potential battle, and thus an other who is to be defeated, subdued, or brought into line. To produce these sounds from the body of the racially and visibly marked other is thus to proclaim, and the choice of verb here is deliberate, that the battle has already been won. The other has already been subdued. Indeed, his docile but potentially ferocious body has been to the task of enforcing the law of the sovereign, as heard in the ceremonial trumpet sound. Here the race of the performer is anything but incidental. The persistent, sticky association of racialized bodies and military music inscribes a violence into and onto the body, and the subjectivity of the body which gives voice, which sounds the trumpet, the direct will of the sovereign. Such sound signals recite or transpose the blackness and racialized appearance of court servants as they appear in early modern portraiture and in art history. Importantly, however, the sources cited above regarding both Solfa and the modo trombetto indicate that their education under Fantini transgressed the military repertoire of civic and courtly ceremonial to include the newer musical repertoire for which Fantini was renowned. Consider that on at least one occasion, the modo trombetto played in the Grand Duke's chambers, an architectural specificity that suggests he was learning the more intimate and technically challenging repertoire foregrounded in Fantini's modo per imparare. The dual adjectives of Fantini's book title, explicitly labeled as a method for playing in battle and musically, reflect the virtuoso's fame as an actual musician, at the forefront of a new practice of playing the trumpet in concert with other instruments. To think about the Grand Duke's black trumpeter, or Solfa, playing this kind of music in the Grand Duke's private chambers speaks to an intimacy, musicality, and the explicitly pleasurable consumption of enslaved labor. Furthermore, to directly consider these players in conjunction with the musica turchesca discussed previously, the documented and deliberately cultivated presence of Turchi and Mori within the ranks of court ensembles begs the question of whether non-European musics were part of their sonic remit. The answer, frustratingly, is that I do not know. I have not been able to ascertain the ages of any of these young musicians, thus it is difficult to infer what level of instrumental training or musical exposure they might have had prior to their arrival at court. Other scholars have encountered similar lacunae in the historical record. Kate Lowe's suggestion that many black court musicians may have been musicians in their earlier lives is speculative and largely based on the close association of musicianship and talent. The two black German trumpeters discussed by Agnes Bohr in his Jams article both received apprenticeships in Europe, and no indication is given that Christian Real and Christian Gottlieb, the two men that Spohr talks about, had had musical training before their enslavement or their arrival in German-speaking lands. Ultimately, it may not matter whether Solfa and his colleagues played authentic non-Western music. Brass and percussion ensembles were well able to imitate a range of janissary sounds, and Fantini himself may have taught his pupils how to play a musica inflected alla turchesca. Now, neither of the examples I have discussed tonight reference the literal voice, though both involve public performance and pageantry. One of the key arguments made in my book is that the narrative expressive function of the operatic voice permeated Italian culture of the 17th century. In opera, the voice narrates. The material sounds, markers of musical genre, vocal and literary register, and the tempi and ornaments of a particular aria revealed not just the emotions felt by a specific character at a specific moment in the plot, but their literal character, their identity, social status, education level, birth rank, all the elements that made up the category of razza as I laid it out earlier. The epistemology of operatic voice ensured that Italian listeners were interpreting sound for what it purportedly revealed about the body. Consider the case of Giovanni, a Morino, black boy, do the sounds click out. Should I keep going?
Keep going, yeah.
Who filed for baptism in 1610, aged approximately 11 years old. This is a letter filed on his behalf. I, Michele Zotti, tailor, attest that I have instructed a little black boy belonging to Madama Christine of Lorraine, whose name is Giovanni, so called because he intends that he will thus be called after the baptism. I have taught him the Our Father, the Hail Mary, and the Credo, even though he does not know them very well, being rather thick. I promise to teach him so often that he will know these things and other things necessary to a Christian, and this much I promise to do, and this being the truth, it is written in my own hand. Now, Giovanni's case was complicated by the question of whether or not the applicant had been previously baptized. It is in this context that some scant details of his pre-Florentine life emerge, as narrated by an English Catholic, Thomas Young, whose name is adorably written as Tommaso Young. I received your dear letter, and about the little black boy, I can tell you nothing except what I've heard related by others. I had him purchased from an English heretic sea captain in Livorno, and he said that he got the boy in Spain, where the boy had been in a convent of friars for many months. And this has the ring of truth, since, as you know, when he first came, he did nothing but sing litanies and other airs that one sings in church, and he also preached. And all of this he would not have been able to learn, having such a hard head, if not for daily exposure and long practice in the aforementioned convent. Now, it's worth considering, assuming all this to be true, that the fathers where he was would not have kept this young boy such a long time without baptizing him or without having some indication that he'd been baptized. However, I do not know this for certain, and if one were to baptize him conditionally, I think it would be all right. I defer to those who better understand these cases, and thus I finish my letter. I ask you to remember me with great affection to this indicated. May our Lord God. According to John's account, Giovanni arrived in Livorno from Spain on a Protestant English ship. All that is known of Giovanni before this point is hearsay, though the veracity of the story can be measured against the young black body that stands in Florence and clamors for baptism. Not only is Giovanni's long stay in a Spanish monastery confirmed by his musical fluency, but also by his capo tanto duro, which, in combination with the musics he absorbed and regurgitated continually, testified to a considerable stay within the monastery walls. The hardness of Giovanni's head is likewise noted by his catechism tutor, the tailor Zotti, who acknowledges Giovanni is rather thick, as well as one of the several priests involved in the deliberations. For modern readers, the purported durezza of this young child is overshadowed by his traumatic biographical trajectory. Language delays and learning disabilities are common in displaced populations. At an age of only 11, Giovanni had already been long separated from his parents, if he ever knew them, spent considerable time in an institutional setting, traversed the Mediterranean, and experienced both the bustling port of Livorno and the city and court of Medici Florence. At the very least, we can presume his exposure to Spanish, Latin, English, and Italian. Rather than an innate stupidity, we might read his durezza as a consequence of trauma. Yet despite his hard head, Giovanni learnt to sing. Indeed, when Giovanni first arrived in Florence, he did little else except sing litanies and other airs that were sung in churches. This melic predilection, Young tells us, was widely known and evidently memorable. Giovanni's early performances must have transmitted a sense of the miraculous. The litanie e altre arie of Christendom emerging from a young and visibly foreign body. Such singing, learned by rote, in John's words, daily exposure and long practice, and disconnected from a sense of semantic comprehension, stands in polar opposition to the kinds of vocal performance more commonly associated with the court of Florence in the years around 1600. Yet to think about Giovanni's arrival in terms of musical sound and performance makes clear that his selection for court service was influenced by his song. If, in the court, Giovanni's song can be presumed to have entertained his audience, the ducal family, courtiers, visitors, clerks, and tailors, on the slave ship, the young boy singing singled him out as a prime candidate for courtly service, precisely because song performs the decorative labor of the black page. His singing voice thus articulates what Matthew Head calls the relationship between the troping of music as other and Orientalism's constructions of otherness. The presence of black children as luxury slaves in Italian courts is well documented. However, these children are difficult to discuss without reinscribing the process of objectification that would render their complexion a self-evident expression of servitude. But Giovanni's singing, by pointing away from the visual surface of race, draws attention to the sonic and to the expressive potential of voice, even while the materiality of the voice as musical object solidifies his value as an object of exchange. Giovanni then is the commodity who sings, while to say so is to signify on Fred Moten's powerful assertion that the slave, contradicting Marx, is the commodity that speaks. Recognizing Giovanni in such terms allows us to notice a similar previously unmarked vocality to others who've been understood as primarily visual pendants to white sovereignty. Isabella d'Este, back in 1491, wrote, "We couldn't be more pleased with our black girl, even if she were blacker, because from being at first a little disdainful, she's now become pleasing in words and acts, and we think she'll make the best buffoon in the world." D'Este's young girl was in training as a professional entertainer, not merely learning a more deferential demeanor. This is a crucial component of black courtly experience that has gone under-recognized. Whenever the Medici accounts cite the actions of court Moors in any details, the activities for which they are rewarded are distinctly buffoonish. On one occasion, for example, in October of 1630, an unnamed woman and the Moor were set to box each other. In January 1631, a Morino was given a scudo for extinguishing a candle with his mouth, and that March, Jacopo Capoletto was paid for 2 beasts which served for the Moor and the buffoon to go about in costume. In November of 1632, the Moor was given 2 testoni, equivalent to 4 lire, which he swallowed. I could cite a legion of other examples. Cumulatively, they demonstrate that the register of the comic was actively associated with racially marked bodies, whose performative antics were rewarded by the sovereign with direct cash payments, while for Italian audiences, such actions testified to their aptitude for enslavement, drawing on deeply embedded assumptions about performance, display, and consumption. In Italian courts, enslaved black and foreign children and racially marked enslaved adults rubbed up against and shared space with other jester figures, including madmen, dwarves, and mutes, human menagerie whose visible differences shored up the able-bodied white male European norm. Giovanni's song confirms his aptitude for court slavery, not because he sings the flexible, expressive music of recitative, but precisely because he doesn't. Indeed, Giovanni sings in what Saidiya Hartman, writing about 19th century chattel slavery in North America, has called the appropriately simple tones of the enslaved. Hartman argues that the enduring association of black bodies and a natural ingrained musicality was taken as evidence for the unaffected simplicity of the black mind and thus their aptitude for enslavement. Giovanni and his colleagues are ascribed a strictly delimited emotional range, constrained, we could call it typecast, by their racially marked bodies and servile status. If song and performance help identify why some enslaved children were understood as suitable for courtly service, and with Solofra, Rosuan, the Moro Trombetto, and Isabella d'Este's unnamed little girl, demonstrate how they were trained or educated in order to fulfill their courtly labors, then the repeated recitation of this trope marks the ways in which the association of racial difference and musical facility was naturalized in the European sonic imaginary. Crucially, the epistemology of expressive voice conflates the aesthetic labor of Giovanni's performance with his character. The purported inheritability of class or lineage, what Isabella d'Este would have called razza, ties these voices and their inherent musical categories to structural possibilities that condition the lives of the individuals concerned. The enslaved singers of the Italian court and stage produce a soundtrack that justifies their enslavement, registering their purportedly contented participation in the institutions of slave labor and of racialization. The role of music in this equation isn't neutral. If, in Monica Miller's words, the luxury black symbolizes the extreme wealth of his owner in the denial of his laboring power and potential, he is perhaps the perfect example of conspicuous consumption. Then the investment of time and money in musical training allows the white elite listener to presume the contentment of the enslaved as the enslaved themselves labored to entertain. It is this, please note, my metaphor that I wrote earlier today, feedback loop. It is this feedback loop that my book attempts to document. The way in which racially marked performers were trained in very specific sounds and practices, and then these sounds were presumed to represent something inherent in their character, what we can call razza. Razza insinuates that the unequal distribution of resources, money, and opportunities is justified by inherited capacities and aptitudes of different categories or types of people. The idea of a racial character or characteristics is retained in the modern conception of race, though whiteness is now assumed to transcend some of the earlier limitations associated with birth. It has become a platitude of progressive history that we should amplify the voices of marginalized historical subjects. But this book complicates that imperative. Voices themselves are shaped and trained by expectations and context. What they reveal may tell us more about what audiences wanted to hear than what individuals wanted to say. Thank you. Yeah, in the baño at that time.
I don't think I've heard of that ever. That's why I was thinking about that. I'm like, 38 trumpeters, where they got their instruments and who trained them, and I don't know. I'm not gonna, I'm opening up this time for questions for this fascinating talk. Yeah, please.
A couple of questions. First of all, your translation of the word Moro as being black, is why do you do that instead of more meaning North African meaning more Arabic than?
Yeah, I mean, I go into this in the book.
Okay.
I think it's really specific to Florence at that time.
Okay.
And when I started, I assumed it meant a more general, in a more general sense. But the more records I read in Florence during this period, the more I realized they were actually being quite specific in their differentiation. So there are people that are called Turco or Turca that are never called Moro Mora. And then some of the documents that are in Latin, the same people that are called Moro are called Negro. So there's a very close kind of mapping. And then the people that we have visual imagery for, who are black, are explicitly called Moro or Morino in the documents. And so over time, as I just saw this over and over and over, I just became more comfortable using Moro in Florence during the 17th century to mean black. And I think it was pretty consistent. I found a couple of individuals who were really explicitly called Moro Bianco, so white Moro. And so one of those people was an albino man from Africa. There's a painting of him. So we know what that meant in his case. He's an 18th century figure though, so I didn't talk about him in the book. And some of the others are much earlier. So what a Moro Bianco was, I was less sure of, but the people that I was able to sort of cross-reference multiple references, they were often called like from Ethiopia or from Borno, which is like in sub-Saharan Africa. So it was just a multitude of references that over time I felt like, the problem is that when we're talking about Europe as a whole over like early modernity, those two terms are very fluid. But I do think that in Florence, in the limited period I was looking at, there is quite some consistency.
Thank you, because in New York here, we're dealing now with a production of Othello, where, you know, more in England at that time meant two different things simultaneously. So,
Yeah.
you know, the next thing I would say, ask is where you talk about the speaking of Turkish from the sailor that fell into the water.
Mm-hmm.
But it was reported by an Italian, Florentine. So my question is, could it not have been Turkish, but rather the lingua franca that was known by both Italians and others? I'm thinking, and this again goes a little bit later, of Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, where he uses sabir as a linguistic substitute for Turkish, and that part of the play was written by by Lee, who learned it in Italy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there was a lingua franca that had a lot of unconjugated verbs,
Yeah.
and it is used as a kind of stage language by a number of different people in Italy who are writing plays and utilizing it. There are also examples where they have Turkish characters who speak like literal Turkish. So the word that's used in that particular source is turquesco.
Oh.
So yeah, it was by an Italian. It could have meant, who knows what they were hearing, but the point is that they were understanding it as foreign, and it was coming from bodies that were very visibly foreign, that made it authentic in that moment. So even though they knew they were watching a performance, they were watching a performance by the people who'd been captured on the ship and watching them kind of fall into the water and scream about it. So there was a realism to it that was magnified by the strange sounds that they heard, whatever it was that they were hearing.
Thank you so much.
Please.
Really interesting talk. I mean, there's so many interesting questions to mind. Heinrich Isaac has a piece called La Mora, and there are dances called frescoes in the 16th century. Is there any relation? I mean, is there any tracing of what those titles might actually mean?
I mean, there's been so much tracing of what Moresca means. The dances on the one hand, and then there are a bunch of like Moresque songs by Lasso, for example. There's a really great article by an Italian ethnomusicologist called Gianfranco Salvatore, where he looks at Lasso's Moresque, and he quotes all of these scholars who over the years have talked about this jargon, this made-up pseudo-African language with these nonsense syllables and this sort of Neapolitan dialect that's there, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, except that this is actually Kanuri. It's a very specific African language, and we can translate these phrases that are in these songs. So that doesn't mean that the people that heard those songs actually spoke Kanuri, but it does mean that certain sounds had become like the way you might write ciao, even if you don't speak a word of Italian. But there were recognizable words and greetings in these foreign languages that turn up in these late 16th century Moresque songs. The Morris dance, the Moresca dance, over and over it has, in different contexts in different countries, it has certain gestures associated with it, bells, very percussive body movements, and it is very unclear whether those could be traced to something in particular, or they're sort of indigenous folk rustic dances. But it is true that in a lot of places they trained up Black or Moorish or Turkish dancers to participate in some of those things. Whether they were, this is kind of the thing with the Black trumpeter, like how much did they bring with them, how much are they learning in place? They are getting tipped when they get it right. So they're thriving, they're succeeding. The ones we know about are the ones that were like, this is what is going to save my life. This is going to make my life better. If I do it this way, this is what they want to hear. So there's a there's a desire, I think, on our part to find the authentic music, and we're never going to know what that is because they weren't being rewarded for necessarily. We don't know when they were being rewarded for making something that was authentic, or when they were making what their audiences wanted to hear.
I mean, Isaac, of course, going back to Lamora,
Yeah.
spent, a huge amount of his, Florence was what he considered home. And and it's earlier than stuff that you're talking about, but it's not earlier than Isabella Desiree. I mean, it's roughly, similar time. Just one other question was, for the singers, you mentioned black children. Do we know anything about what happened to them as they got older, as they grew up?
I mean, that particular individual, Giovanni, I have those baptismal documents for him and the letters that were filed on his behalf, and then I don't know anything that happened to him after that point.
As their voices changed, were like so many.
Yeah,
Mozart.
I mean, this one on the cowboy here, that's Bonacorsi, who I talk about in the second half of the book, and he sung soprano,
Yeah.
presumably castrato, but
Yeah. So.
Here?
Oh.
Please.
Hi, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I couldn't help but notice the prominence of the trumpet and percussion instruments.
Yeah.
Two of the instruments that have become gendered through their military associations, like in some of the most prominent ways. And I was curious if there's any language around gender of the players in the archives, or if that comes up at all.
I mean, most of the people that played trumpet, all of the people that we know that played trumpet or drums were male. One of the things that I talk about in the book that I didn't talk about here is that trumpet and drums weren't really classified as musicians in the 17th century. So there's a lot of literature now that says like black enslaved people were often musicians, and then they almost all turn out to be trumpeters or drummers. And in the records, they have these lists. They say musici, musicisti, and then they say trombeti. They're in different places. They're not classified as the same thing. They were tools. They were signal. They were instruments, signal instruments, but instrument in the sense of a tool that has a function. And they were beautiful. They could be musical in our very modern sense of it. But like Fantini was one of the first that was like, he was the first person that published any music for trumpet, and he's vaunted in Moran's discussion of him and in his own publicity materials as having invented this new musical way to play the trumpet. He plays the trumpet militarily and musically. And like the pieces that he's published are in this particular clarino register of the trumpet, where the series is close enough together that you can get basically a whole scale. And so the music is all in that like part of the trumpet. And it's written with basso continuo or like coda di organ. And so it's very different music from the kind of that was learned like by rote and by repetition, and by when you first started playing, you would play just the basic note and you were just keeping the rhythm. Like, you could learn that pretty fast. And then after years of doing that, you might be allowed to play up third. How exciting would that be? So a lot of this music of the trumpet and drums was very much like all you had to really do was be able to blow in the embouchure. And if you could do that, then you could be a trumpeter. So that the language around it is just all very much like this is the functional kind of thing that we have. And every galley boat would have had trumpeters to communicate with ports when they got close, to communicate with other boats. They had like these set musical patterns that were, like when people used to have pages, they would send like a number that meant like coming home for dinner now, like 165, they'd be like blowing the like 165. It's time for dinner. It was a function that those instruments had, which is different from like Bonacorsi was trained as a chamber singer. That's something very, very different.
Thanks, Emily, for your talk. I'm so excited to read the book. I was really struck by your citations of thinkers like Fred Moten, Sadie Hartman, Sylvia Winter, and even now thinking about the trumpet as a kind of instrument of alterity or a non-musical instrument. Your talk ended with kind of what I interpreted to be kind of a critique of this, kind of a common liberal NR, like music allows an individual to express themselves. And I guess I was just like, I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts about how specifically voice, slavery, and race in 17th-century Florence maybe intersects with like more contemporary discussions about race, alterity, and like voice and expression in our current, like, in our life, like right now.
Yeah.
In the theoretical world of like Moten and Hartman and Katie.
Yeah, I think that the modern understanding of voice is really dependent on the 17th century Baroque expressive voice of the opera, where instead of a sort of communal madrigal where the voice might sort of shift, or it might be a narrative voice, or you might be word painting, you get a lyric first-person I that is really prioritized by the text setting, by the whole idea of the recitative. That sense that the music is going to narrate, the sounds are going to tell a story better than just having the words alone. That's the premise of opera, that there's something conveyed, like something that's coming through, that is going to illustrate. You're going to literally see Ariana lamenting and hear her lament in the moment that it happens. I think that sense of voice, which emerges at that moment, has kind of grown and absorbed a whole lot of political meanings that it didn't have in the 17th century about democracy and a sort of post-Enlightenment idea that you educate enough people, they're going to be successful regardless of who their parents were, and we're going to have a meritocracy and everyone will kind of rise to the top. So I think that by looking at the 17th century, where that concept of the meritocracy didn't exist, but this new idea of the voice is being really widely disseminated. Opera kind of spreads throughout Europe in a very Italianate form and is hugely popular and influential in music all across Europe and then in the colonies, disseminating this idea. And I think that by realizing how little agency and how little actual kind of personal expression was understood to be in that music, it can help us peel apart a little bit the assumptions that we assume to be inherent in voice. Robert Jernigan has this great line in the introduction to his big Partimenti book where he says, the idea for the gallant patron that the sad piece written by the court composer was about the court composer's sadness would have been as absurd as the idea that a tart sauce from the chef was about the chef being tart. And it really pulls apart this idea that the music is expressing something on the part of the composer or the performer, because instead the music is representing something. But we now really invest in this idea of the expression on the part of the performer, on the part of the composer, that the musician is getting out their feelings, that they're expressing, communicating something with us. And that being caught up with the sort of political idea that your voice will be heard has led us right now into a difficult situation, I think, where, particularly under the first Trump administration, there was a lot of idea that if we just revealed the horrible things that were happening, those voices would be heard and some progress would be made. And yet it has become very apparent that you can speak as loudly as you want, but if your voice is not necessarily going to be heard, you can vote and the voices won't necessarily be heard. And I think that for me, I feel that by looking at these earlier periods where we have to peel back some of our assumptions is a really useful tool for them looking at more current moments and helping to identify the assumptions that are at work and maybe how they're operating in ways that are disorienting to us, because I don't think voice and agency were connected in the 17th century. And I don't think they're that connected now, but we keep acting as if they are. Maybe we need to do something different.